January 1944. Northern Italy. Dawn has not yet reached the valley, but the cold has already settled into the bones. Frost clings to olive branches and broken stone walls, turning the ground hard beneath worn boots. A British infantry section lies pressed into the earth, breathing slow, waiting. Somewhere ahead, a German machine gun opens fire. The sound is sharp and mechanical, a tearing rip that cuts across the hillside and pins everything in place. Dirt lifts. Stone chips shatter. Firepower dominates the moment, just as it always does. The soldier at the center of the section does not look up. He does not rush. His movements are small, practiced, almost dull in their precision. Rifle checked. Distance measured by eye. Angle remembered from training fields far from this place. Around him, others move when he moves, not because they are brave, but because they know exactly what comes next. German rounds hammer the slope again, louder now, closer. The enemy has the gun, the height, the advantage. Yet this is not the first time firepower has tried to stop him. And it will not be the last. What matters is not the weapon firing down the hill, but the training carried quietly upward toward it, training that has already begun to turn the balance, one controlled step at a time. If this moment stayed with you, comment below, like, and subscribe for more true World War II stories. By the winter of 1943 to 1944, the Second World War had entered a phase where power no longer rested solely in numbers or ambition, but in systems refined by failure. The German army had spent years perfecting a doctrine built around firepower, mobility, and psychological shock. From Poland to France, from the steppes of the East to the deserts of North Africa, German infantry units were trained to fight around the machine gun. The MG-34 and later the MG-42 were not simply weapons. They were the center of gravity for German small unit tactics. Riflemen existed to protect the gun, feed it ammunition, and maneuver in support of its killing zone. In open ground, this doctrine had proven devastating. Fire dominated movement. Movement died under fire. The British Army had learned this lesson the hard way. In the early years of the war, British infantry units were often brave but poorly prepared for the realities of modern, mechanized conflict. Training before 1939 still carried echoes of the previous war, emphasizing parade ground discipline and marksmanship, but not the chaos of combined arms combat. When British troops met German formations in France in 1940, they faced an enemy that moved faster, struck harder, and coordinated fire and maneuver with ruthless efficiency. German units did not need to outnumber their opponents. Their firepower created fear, confusion, and paralysis. The result was collapse, retreat, and the long road back across the Channel. North Africa brought no immediate relief. In the deserts of Libya and Egypt, German and Italian forces again demonstrated the lethal effectiveness of well-handled machine guns and flexible leadership. British units often found themselves pinned down by unseen fire, uncertain how to advance without suffering unacceptable losses. Reports from the field were blunt. Men were not failing because they lacked courage. They were failing because they had not been trained for this kind of war. Courage alone could not cross open ground swept by automatic fire. German success rested on more than weapons. Their training emphasized decentralization, initiative, and relentless drilling under realistic conditions. Junior leaders were expected to think, adapt, and act without waiting for orders. Rehearsal bred confidence. Confidence bred speed. Speed kept the enemy off balance. Against this system, unprepared troops were overwhelmed before they could react. The battlefield did not forgive hesitation. By 1941, British commanders began to confront an uncomfortable truth. The problem was not German superiority as soldiers, but British failure as a system. After-action reports, training evaluations, and hard-earned battlefield experience pointed to the same conclusion. Infantry units needed more than rifles and bravery. They needed drills that could be executed under fire, leadership that functioned when communications failed, and habits so ingrained that men could act correctly even when fear threatened to take over. Reform did not come quickly, but it came decisively. Training establishments were restructured. Live-fire exercises became harsher and more realistic. Soldiers were drilled to move by bounds, to use terrain instinctively, and to close with enemy machine guns rather than freeze beneath them. Section and platoon commanders were given greater responsibility, expected to make immediate decisions instead of waiting for instructions from above. Mistakes in training were encouraged, examined, and corrected before they could become fatal in combat. By the time British forces returned to the European continent in strength, they were not the same army that had retreated in 1940. They were quieter, more methodical, and far less impressed by the sound of German firepower. Men had learned that machine guns, no matter how fast they fired, could not see everything at once. They had learned that movement, if controlled and timed, could still happen under fire. And they had learned that training, repeated until it felt almost boring, could decide survival in moments when thinking was impossible. Those lessons would soon be tested again, this time not in classrooms or exercise fields, but on real hillsides, against real guns, where training would either assert itself or fail completely. By 1942, the British Army had begun to rebuild itself from the inside out, not through sweeping declarations, but through relentless attention to detail. Training manuals were rewritten, not to glorify combat, but to strip it down to fundamentals that could survive fear, exhaustion, and confusion. Infantry training shifted away from abstract theory and toward repetition under stress. Men learned not just what to do, but when to do it, and more importantly, how to do it when visibility was poor, orders were incomplete, and enemy fire was close enough to be felt rather than seen. At the heart of this transformation was the infantry section. The British section was small, intimate, and deliberately structured so that no single loss would collapse the whole. Every man was trained to understand the task beyond his immediate role. Riflemen learned the importance of suppressive fire. Bren gunners learned when to fire and when to move. Runners, scouts, and grenadiers trained as if they might be required to lead in the absence of orders. This was not heroism. It was redundancy, built through training until it became instinctive. Leadership, particularly at the junior level, was treated as a skill that could be taught rather than a quality one either possessed or lacked. Corporals and lance corporals were pushed hard, corrected openly, and trusted early. They were expected to control men under fire, to read ground quickly, and to act without hesitation when an opportunity appeared. Instructors emphasized that hesitation was often deadlier than a wrong decision. A flawed plan executed immediately could still succeed. A perfect plan delayed often failed. British training also confronted fear directly. Live ammunition was used more frequently. Exercises were conducted at night, in bad weather, and under physical exhaustion. Soldiers were taught to recognize the sound of incoming fire, to distinguish between rounds passing overhead and those aimed directly at them. This knowledge reduced panic. Fear, once understood, became manageable. Men who knew what danger sounded like were less likely to imagine it everywhere. Nowhere was this approach more thoroughly applied than in preparation for the Italian campaign. Italy was not open desert or flat farmland. It was a landscape of ridges, stone walls, vineyards, and narrow valleys where machine guns could dominate entire approaches. German units understood this terrain well and exploited it expertly. British planners knew that no amount of artillery could solve every problem here. Infantry would have to move forward deliberately, often without armor, often under direct fire. The soldier at the center of this story passed through this system quietly. His name appeared on training rosters, range reports, and unit returns, but nowhere did it stand out. He was not unique in talent, size, or temperament. What distinguished him was exposure to a training regime that demanded consistency rather than brilliance. He learned the same drills repeatedly, corrected the same mistakes until they disappeared, and absorbed lessons that were never framed as heroic, only necessary. By the time his unit deployed, he had learned to measure ground without thinking, to move when others fired, and to fire when others moved. He understood how German machine gun teams positioned themselves, how long they could maintain fire before needing to adjust, and how their confidence often depended on the belief that the enemy would remain pinned. He also understood that this belief could be broken, not by reckless charge, but by controlled pressure applied from unexpected angles. The British army that entered Italy in late 1943 carried no illusions about the cost of progress. Casualties were expected. Setbacks were inevitable. But there was a quiet confidence in preparation, a belief that training, if executed without deviation, could narrow the gap between men facing superior firepower and men capable of defeating it. That confidence did not announce itself. It revealed itself only in moments of action, when decisions had to be made in seconds and training stepped in where fear might otherwise have taken control. Those moments were coming. And when they arrived, the difference between firepower and discipline would no longer be theoretical. It would be measured in yards gained, lives spared, and positions taken, one engagement at a time. The first angle is human, because no doctrine matters unless it can function inside a frightened mind. Combat strips away confidence faster than training can build it, and yet British reforms were designed precisely for that moment when fear arrived uninvited. For the soldier at the center of this story, fear was not absent, it was familiar. He had been trained to expect it, to recognize its physical signs, and to act anyway. Training gave him something to do when thinking became difficult. When German fire cracked overhead, his body responded before his emotions could interfere. He adjusted his position, checked his spacing, and waited for the correct moment, not because he felt calm, but because he had done it countless times before. Fear did not vanish. It narrowed, contained by repetition. The second angle is training itself, not as a concept, but as a mechanical process. British infantry training emphasized drills that could be executed in fragments. A section did not need to hear the entire plan to begin moving. Each man understood his immediate task and trusted that others were doing the same. Fire and movement were broken down into simple actions, repeated until complexity disappeared. In action, this meant that German firepower, though intense, rarely halted movement entirely. Suppression was met with counter-suppression. One group fired. Another moved. The sequence continued forward in short, controlled bursts. Training turned chaos into manageable pieces, and those pieces could be handled even under pressure. The third angle is tactical, rooted in how British soldiers were taught to read terrain. German machine gun teams relied on predictable fields of fire, dominating obvious approaches and killing ground. British training taught men to distrust obvious paths. Stone walls, folds in the ground, hedges, and shell craters were not obstacles but tools. The soldier learned to move diagonally, not straight ahead, to pause where the enemy did not expect pause, and to appear where fire had not yet been adjusted. These movements were small, often invisible to anyone watching from a distance, but they accumulated. Each controlled advance shortened the distance German firepower needed to dominate. Each yard gained reduced the machine gun's advantage. In this quiet contest between discipline and volume of fire, training did not seek to overpower the enemy. It sought to outlast him. These angles did not exist separately. They fed into one another, reinforcing a pattern that repeated across engagements. Human control allowed drills to function. Drills enabled movement. Movement undermined firepower. And as this pattern repeated, German confidence, built on the expectation of paralysis, began to erode, setting the stage for moments where the balance would finally tip. The fourth angle belongs to the enemy, because understanding German firepower also means understanding its limits. German infantry doctrine assumed that well-placed machine guns would dominate the battlefield long enough for maneuver elements to destroy or displace the enemy. This worked best against opponents who froze, hesitated, or attempted to rush without coordination. When British sections continued to move despite incoming fire, German gunners were forced to constantly readjust aim, shift positions, and expend ammunition at an unsustainable rate. Machine guns were lethal, but they were not omniscient. They could not cover every fold of ground at once, and their crews were vulnerable when forced to reposition. Each time British training enabled movement under fire, it disrupted the rhythm German doctrine depended upon. The fifth angle is leadership, especially at the lowest level, where battles were often decided. British corporals and lance corporals were no longer passive messengers waiting for orders. They were trained to act as battlefield managers, controlling pace and direction in real time. The soldier at the center of this story often operated within sight of such leaders, responding to brief gestures, shouted corrections, or simply understood intent. When officers were absent or communications failed, junior leaders filled the gap without ceremony. This flexibility denied German units the advantage of targeting command structures. Even when firepower killed or wounded leaders, the section continued to function, guided by shared training rather than individual authority. Together, these angles revealed a quiet truth of mid-war infantry combat. Firepower could dominate space, but training dominated time. German guns could stop an advance briefly, but disciplined soldiers could resume it again and again. Each encounter reinforced the same lesson, not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through cumulative pressure. German positions were not overrun by sudden brilliance, but worn down by men who refused to behave as expected under fire. That refusal would soon matter in a way that no training exercise could fully simulate. Because training prepares soldiers for moments it cannot replicate, moments when the enemy fires without pause, when the ground offers little protection, and when decisions must be made instantly. Those moments were approaching now, compressing time and consequence into a single stretch of ground where training would be tested to its limits. February 1944. The Italian front had hardened into a grinding stalemate, defined by ridgelines, rivers, and German defensive belts layered with machine guns and mortars. In the hills north of the Rapido River, British infantry units were tasked with probing positions that had already repelled multiple assaults. The terrain favored the defender completely. Narrow approaches funneled attackers into predictable lines of advance. Stone farmhouses and terraced slopes provided German units with concealed firing positions, while winter rain turned open ground into slick, exposed killing zones. This was not a battlefield that rewarded speed or bravado. It rewarded patience, discipline, and precision. The soldier and his section advanced before first light, moving without noise, spacing themselves by habit rather than command. German fire began almost immediately once daylight crept into the valley. A machine gun opened from the flank, sweeping across the slope with methodical bursts. Another answered from higher ground. The sound multiplied, echoing through stone and earth, creating the illusion of overwhelming numbers. This was deliberate. German doctrine relied on sensory dominance, saturating the battlefield with noise and violence to paralyze movement. The section halted, not because it was ordered to, but because training dictated it. Men dropped instinctively, not clumping together, not scrambling, but settling into positions that offered the smallest margin of cover. The Bren gun came forward, placed low, its barrel angled toward the suspected firing position. The soldier waited for the signal he already anticipated. When it came, it was not a shouted command, but a shift in posture from the corporal beside him. Suppression began immediately, controlled and deliberate, not wasteful. The German gun did not stop firing, but its rhythm changed, reacting instead of dominating. Movement followed fire without pause. The soldier advanced in short bursts, counting steps unconsciously, sliding into the shadow of a shallow fold in the ground. He did not look back. He did not need to. He trusted that the section was doing what it had been trained to do. Each man knew his role, and no one waited for reassurance. German rounds snapped overhead, close enough to be felt as pressure rather than sound. Dirt jumped. Stone cracked. Still, movement continued. The distance closed slowly, yard by yard, without any dramatic rush. German gunners adjusted, shifting fire, trying to anticipate where the next movement would appear. Each adjustment took time. Each delay allowed another few steps forward. Training transformed time into space. Space reduced firepower's advantage. The soldier reached a low wall, its stones slick with moisture, and pressed against it, breathing steady, rifle ready. He did not fire yet. He waited because training had taught him when firing mattered. To his left, another group moved, unseen by the German gun. Their approach was masked by terrain the defenders had dismissed as impassable. This was not improvisation. It was the application of lessons drilled repeatedly in exercises that had felt tedious at the time. German firepower, though relentless, could not cover every angle simultaneously. The defenders had assumed the ground itself was protection. Training had taught the attackers otherwise. As the section converged, German fire intensified, but its effectiveness diminished. Ammunition was expended rapidly. Barrels overheated. Communication between German positions became strained under pressure. What had begun as confident suppression turned into reactive defense. The soldier recognized the shift not intellectually, but physically. The rhythm of fire changed. Gaps appeared. Training told him what that meant. The final approach was not dramatic. There was no charge, no shouted defiance. It was a continuation of the same controlled movement that had brought him this far. When the section broke into the German position, it did so with speed born of familiarity. Grenades were used precisely, not excessively. Rifle fire was close, deliberate, and brief. Within minutes, the firing that had dominated the hillside fell silent. This was not an isolated success. It mirrored actions taken by other British sections across the front, applying the same principles under different conditions. But for the soldier, this engagement marked something unmistakable. German firepower had not failed because it was weak. It had failed because it had been confronted by men trained not to surrender initiative under pressure. The hill was taken. The position secured. And as reports filtered upward, it became clear that something larger than a single engagement was unfolding, a shift that would soon repeat itself again and again under even harsher conditions. The capture of the position did not end the pressure. German doctrine did not concede ground easily, and counterattacks were expected almost immediately. Within hours, artillery began to fall, probing for weaknesses, followed by renewed machine gun fire from adjacent ridgelines. The soldiers' section reorganized without instruction, redistributing ammunition, checking casualties, and adjusting arcs of fire. Training dictated the sequence. No one waited to be told what came next because everyone already knew. The position they now held was exposed, and holding it would demand the same discipline that had taken it. As German fire resumed, it became clear that the enemy was attempting to reassert dominance through volume rather than maneuver. Machine guns opened from distance, firing long bursts designed to pin rather than kill. Mortars followed, their rounds walking closer with each adjustment. This was a test not of courage, but of endurance. The soldier remained low, controlling his breathing, conserving ammunition. He fired only when movement appeared, not at sound or suspicion. Training had taught him that waste was vulnerability. What unfolded over the next hours was not a dramatic reversal, but a slow confirmation of a truth British units were beginning to recognize across the Italian front. German firepower could still inflict casualties, but it no longer dictated the battle's outcome by itself. British sections responded methodically, shifting positions by inches, reinforcing weak points, and refusing to break contact. Each German attempt to suppress was met with controlled return fire, not enough to exhaust supplies, but enough to deny freedom of movement. At one point, a German patrol attempted to probe the newly taken ground, advancing cautiously under covering fire. The soldier spotted the movement not because it was obvious, but because training had taught him where movement was most likely to appear. He signaled quietly. Fire was coordinated without words. The patrol withdrew, leaving the ground contested but held. This pattern repeated through the day. German firepower tested. British discipline absorbed the pressure. By nightfall, the significance of what had occurred began to take shape beyond the immediate fight. The position the section held was not valuable for its size, but for what it represented. It overlooked approaches previously dominated by German guns. With that dominance broken, adjacent units could move with reduced risk. The front line adjusted subtly, but decisively. This was how progress happened in Italy, not through sweeping breakthroughs, but through accumulated denial of enemy advantage. For the soldier, the experience reinforced lessons learned long before reaching the front. Training had not removed danger. It had not guaranteed survival, but it had replaced helplessness with agency. Under fire, he had not waited for opportunity. He had created it, step by trained step. German firepower had been real, deadly, and sustained. It had simply failed to impose paralysis. Reports filed after the engagement reflected this shift in tone. Where earlier accounts spoke of units pinned and halted, newer reports emphasized controlled advances under fire and successful neutralization of machine gun positions. Language mattered. It revealed confidence. British commanders began to trust infantry sections to operate independently for longer periods, knowing their training could sustain them under pressure. This engagement was not unique. Similar actions unfolded across the front, involving different units, different men, and different terrain. Yet the pattern remained consistent. Where training was applied faithfully, German firepower lost its decisive edge. The soldier would face similar conditions again, different hills, different weapons, the same underlying contest. Each time, training would assert itself quietly, not through spectacle, but through repetition. The turning point was not a single shot or decision. It was the realization, earned repeatedly, that firepower alone no longer decided encounters. That realization would shape what followed, influencing tactics, confidence, and expectations as the war moved forward into its final, most demanding phases. The immediate aftermath of the engagement was measured not in celebration, but in quiet accounting. Casualty reports were compiled with the same discipline that had governed the fighting itself. Losses had occurred, as they always did in close infantry combat against prepared positions. Yet they were notably lower than those suffered in earlier assaults against similar terrain. This difference did not go unnoticed. Commanders compared reports, terrain sketches, and timings, and a consistent picture began to emerge. Where British infantry applied their training without deviation, advances that once seemed impossible became sustainable. German units, for their part, recorded frustration. Intercepted communications and post-war analyses would later reveal a growing concern about British infantry tactics. Reports noted that British sections no longer halted under machine gun fire as predictably as before. Movement continued despite suppression, often exploiting ground German defenders believed impassable. Machine gun crews found themselves forced to reposition repeatedly, exposing themselves to counterfire and infiltration. The very weapons that had once guaranteed dominance now demanded protection they could not always receive. On the British side, the psychological impact was immediate and profound. Soldiers who had endured earlier phases of the war recognized the change instinctively. Confidence grew, not as bravado, but as trust in preparation. Men began to believe that survival and success were not solely matters of chance. This belief altered behavior. Units advanced with greater cohesion, maintained spacing more effectively, and recovered more quickly from setbacks. Training had created a feedback loop in which success reinforced discipline, and discipline produced further success. The soldier at the center of this story did not receive medals for this engagement alone, nor did his actions appear in newspapers. His name remained buried in unit records and operational summaries. Yet his experience was replicated across the British Army. Thousands of men applied the same drills, the same discipline, and the same understanding of ground and fire. Individually, their actions seemed small. Collectively, they reshaped how the British Army fought. Strategically, these changes accumulated into operational momentum. German defensive lines in Italy, once considered nearly impregnable, began to fracture under sustained pressure. Not through overwhelming firepower, but through the steady erosion of advantage. Positions were turned. Supply routes were threatened. Commanders were forced to commit reserves more frequently, reducing their flexibility elsewhere. Each successful infantry action narrowed German options. British training doctrine, once criticized as rigid and unimaginative, gained new credibility. After-action reviews emphasized the importance of consistency over improvisation. Units that adhered closely to training principles consistently performed better than those that attempted ad hoc solutions under fire. This reinforced institutional confidence in the system that had been built since 1941. For the soldier, the aftermath was marked by preparation for what came next rather than reflection on what had passed. Equipment was cleaned. Positions were strengthened. Orders arrived for further advances. The war did not pause to acknowledge lessons learned. It demanded they be applied again immediately, under new conditions and against an enemy still capable of inflicting deadly force. The ground taken was held. the line moved forward. And with each movement, the realization deepened that this was not an isolated outcome, but part of a larger pattern, one that would continue to shape the fighting in the months ahead as British forces carried their training into even more demanding battles. As the campaign progressed, the cumulative effect of these engagements became impossible to ignore. British infantry units, once perceived as cautious to the point of paralysis, were now regarded by German commanders as methodical and persistently dangerous. This shift was reflected in operational planning on both sides. German defenses grew denser, relying on additional layers of fire and increased use of mines and obstacles, acknowledging that machine guns alone could no longer guarantee control of ground. These adaptations, however, came at a cost, stretching manpower and resources already under strain. British doctrine continued to emphasize preparation over spectacle. Training cycles were refined even during active operations, with lessons from the front incorporated into instruction almost immediately. Replacements were introduced to units not as raw manpower, but as soldiers already familiar with the drills they would need under fire. This continuity preserved effectiveness even as casualties mounted. The system did not depend on exceptional individuals. It depended on predictable competence. The soldier whose experience anchors this narrative moved through subsequent operations with the same quiet consistency. Each new engagement reinforced what he already understood. German firepower remained lethal, but it was no longer absolute. The sound of automatic fire still demanded respect, but it no longer dictated behavior. Training had reshaped instinct itself. When fire erupted, movement followed. When movement stalled, fire adjusted. The pattern repeated, engagement after engagement. This approach influenced broader Allied operations beyond Italy. British infantry units in northwest Europe applied similar principles following the Normandy landings, where German firepower again dominated terrain through machine gun nests and interlocking fields of fire. The same training allowed British soldiers to advance through hedgerows, villages, and fortified positions that had once appeared insurmountable. While technology and support weapons evolved, the core lesson remained unchanged. Firepower could suppress. Training could overcome. Official histories and post-war analyses would later identify this period as a maturation point for the British Army. The force that entered the war in 1939 was not the force that helped carry it to its conclusion. Change had been forced by defeat, refined by experience, and sustained by discipline. The British soldier was no longer defined by tradition alone, but by adaptability learned through hard training. For the German army, this evolution removed one of its greatest advantages. The expectation that enemy infantry would halt under machine gun fire could no longer be relied upon. Each time that expectation failed, German units were compelled to react rather than control. Reaction ceded initiative. Initiative shaped outcomes. The balance of small unit combat shifted subtly but decisively. By the war's final year, this pattern had repeated so often that it no longer surprised those who lived it. British soldiers did not speak of training as an abstract concept. They spoke of it as something that worked, something that had kept them alive when nothing else could. The war still demanded sacrifice. Training did not eliminate loss, but it narrowed the margin between survival and destruction in ways that technology alone could not. As the fighting moved toward its conclusion, the significance of these lessons extended beyond any single soldier or battlefield. They pointed toward a deeper understanding of modern warfare, one in which human preparation, applied consistently, could challenge even the most formidable instruments of destruction. That understanding would endure long after the guns fell silent. When the war finally ended, the landscapes that had shaped these lessons fell quiet. Hillsides once torn by machine gun fire returned to silence, their scars slowly softened by time. What remained were not the sounds of weapons, but the understanding of what had truly mattered when firepower dominated the ground. The story of one British soldier is not a story of exceptional strength or rare courage. It is a story of preparation carried faithfully into moments where preparation was all that remained. German firepower was real, formidable, and terrifying. It shaped the battlefield and claimed countless lives. Yet it was not invincible. Against it stood men whose training taught them how to function when fear narrowed their world, how to move when instinct urged them to stop, and how to trust systems built long before the first shot was fired. Training did not make them fearless. It made them reliable, and reliability proved stronger than intimidation. This quiet contest between discipline and destruction repeated itself across the war's later years. Again and again, British infantry demonstrated that control could survive chaos, and that preparation could assert itself even under the most punishing conditions. These victories were rarely dramatic. They unfolded in inches gained, positions held, and moments where panic did not take over. They were not remembered for spectacle, but for consistency. The soldier at the center of this story returned home without ceremony. His contribution was not captured in headlines, but it lived on in doctrine, in training manuals, and in the understanding passed to future generations of soldiers. His experience reflected a truth the war had made unavoidable. Technology can dominate a battlefield, but it cannot think, adapt, or endure on its own. Those qualities belong to people, shaped by training long before they are tested. In the end, the war was not decided solely by who possessed the most powerful weapons, but by who prepared most thoroughly to face them. And in that preparation, repeated quietly across fields, ranges, and frozen mornings, the outcome was already beginning to take shape, long before the first machine gun ever opened fire.